Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagatgurum. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our class, Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. In our last class, we discussed up to verse 15 of chapter 3 of the Gita, some somewhat abstruse verses on what seems to be Vedic ritualistic sacrifice, but Sri Aurobindo is suggesting that in light of chapter 4, which we're going to start discussing today, and the verses on sacrifice, yajna, in chapter 4, he sees good reason to interpret these verses in chapter 3 on yajna, sacrifice, in a more spiritual and symbolic manner that broadens its significance. Okay? So that's as far as we got. And now we're going to start with verse 16, but I wanted to give you a heads up on things. So, in today's class, we're going to be discussing verses 16 through 20 of chapter 3 and verses 23 to 27 of chapter 4. Sounds like we're jumping, but that's because Sri Aurobindo's commentary itself it doesn't go completely sequentially all the time, and there's a good reason for why he's skipping. It's because he's talking about sacrifice in both chapters 3 and chapter 4. Okay, and so all of these verses that we're going to be talking about today, 3:16 to 3:20 and 4:23 to 27, are all based on chapter 12 of Essays on the Gita, called The Significance of Sacrifice, which you've already read. Okay, I assigned 4 study questions for today, and what we'll do is, my plan is, and it's a lot to cover, and so please save your questions till the end of the class. My plan is, we're going to cover the first 3 study questions. And the 4th study question we're going to discuss next week. Our next class is next Sunday. I'm not giving any extra homework. Yay! Okay, except for those of you, I'm not looking at anybody in particular, who didn't complete the study questions. I'm giving you another chance. You can see, looking at me? Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna repost the same study questions and submit them by this coming Saturday, 7 p.m. And we'll focus on study question 4 next week. Okay. Good, I think that's enough. And so next week we're going to discuss, ideally, verses 4.28 to 35. Okay? And the 4th study question. Very good. Now, let's begin with verse 16 of chapter 3. Please repeat after me. Evam pravattitam chakram nanuvartayati hayaha. It's a little hard. Na anuvartayati iha. Yeah, it's a little hard, but anyway, it's fine. Good enough. Aghayurindriya ramo Mogham partha sajivati. Hey Partha, O Arjuna, yaha eha evam pravattitam chakram na anuvartayati. Anyone who does not follow this wheel of sacrifice, we just saw that in the previous class about the cycle and rain and all sorts of funny stuff happening. Okay, that's what is being referred to. Aghayuhu, kind of sometimes Krishna will burst into very strong language, condemnatory language. So here, he's coming down pretty hard on the sensuous person. Aghayuhu, meaning he's very sinful, evil, in fact. Indriya aramaha, the person who delights only in the senses, in sense pleasures, sense indulgences. Saha mogam jivati, that person lives in vain. Vanity of vanities. Okay, so pretty strong language. I want to remind you of one. Okay, let's remember one thing that Sri Aurobindo mentioned. We talked about this in our last class. Sri Aurobindo distinguishes 3 ways of living in this world, and they're clearly in sequence. One is superior to the other. First way of living, exclusively selfish existence. You live only to maximize your own self-pleasure, sense pleasures. It's a kind of life of extreme hedonism. And one thing I think that the Gita is saying is, and I think it's referring to this first kind of, this first stage, when he's saying, Aghayurindriya ramo mogam pati, that person lives in vain whose sole purpose in life, or main purpose, is sense enjoyment. Lives in vain, it means different things. One thing is, it means you're not going to reach the highest spiritual goal, but I think that there's a deeper point here from a psychological standpoint. Even if the whole purpose of this selfish person's existence is to maximize happiness, that person will never succeed. Try to live a life based on maximizing sense pleasures and you'll end up unhappy. This is what modern positive psychology is finding again and again. There's a whole book written, there are multiple books. One that I like is Martin Seligman's book called Authentic Happiness. And he distinguishes 3 ways of living. And the first kind of life he calls the pleasant life, which is exactly like this. And he says, study after study has shown that living a life of hedonism based on maximizing sense pleasures will lead to, it's a recipe for unhappiness, not happiness. And then he goes on to explain how we can live a more fulfilling life. Okay, but that's the first stage, absolutely selfish existence. Second stage, Sri Aurobindo says, is the stage of Vedic ritualism. In the fundamentalist sense, in the early traditional Vedic sense, it means you offer sacrifices to the devas, these deities. For what purpose? To enjoy here and to enjoy hereafter in a heaven. And then you come back again, repeat, rinse and repeat. You do the sacrifices again. Again, you enjoy here and you enjoy in the hereafter. Then you come back again. That's better because at least you're acknowledging this wheel of sacrifice, this law of sacrifice. You're not living. You're offering things to the gods, and so you're a little less selfish than that first stage of the people in the first stage. But that's not Vedanta yet. Sri Aurobindo says there's a higher way of living, this third way of living. So 1, 2. Now we have 3. Here, you do the work as karma yoga. This is the fundamental teaching of the Bhagavad Gita. What does that mean, and how is it different from stage 2? Stage 2, there's still a desire for fruits of the actions. I want to enjoy. I want enjoyment. I want happiness. The karma yogi says, I don't care about any of that. I'm doing it as an offering. Whatever I do it as an offering to the divine. That's karma yoga. That spirit. If you do it in that spirit, everything becomes sacrifice. And every action becomes a spiritual practice and helps you to make spiritual progress by purifying the mind and bringing you closer to divine consciousness. Okay? So, keep all that in mind. Now let's look at the next verse, 17. Please repeat after me. Yastvat maratireva syat atma triptascha manavaha atmanyeva cha santushtas tasya karyam na vidyate. Yaha manavaha, that person, tu atmaratihi eva. The tu here is important. Tu in Indian languages, Bengali kintu, it means but. So this is but, the tu. We'll see why that's relevant. B-U-T, not the other but. Okay. Tu. Atmaratihi eva. That person who delights in the Atman. Atma triptaha cha. That person who is content in the Atman alone. Atmani eva santushtaha. Again, tripta, santushta mean very similar things. Santushta means content also, something like satisfied, content. Jasyat tasya karyam na vidyate. That person who's basically realized, right? Who's realized the Atman, finds his or her whole soul satisfaction in the self. Tasya karyam na vidyate. That person has no karyam. The word karyam is significant here. Literally means duty. Okay, and that's how Sri Aurobindo interprets it. That person has no work that needs to be done. Notice his translation of this word, karyam. The word is not karma. Notice, it could have been karma. Tasya karma na vidyate. That means there's no work for that person. There, Śaṅkara would be very, very happy. Okay, but nonetheless, Śaṅkara is having a field day with this verse. And he says, see, especially this tu. However, what Śaṅkara is saying, all the preceding verses, right, the ones we discussed last week about sacrifice, applies only to the Manda Adhikari. The Manda Adhikari, the inferior spiritual aspirant like Arjuna, who is eligible for action. But the tu in verse 17, yastvatma ratireva syat, yastu atma, the tu. But, Krishna says, but for the person who is much more spiritually evolved, either already a realized soul or very close to being a realized soul, at least eligible for Jnana Yoga, the higher practice of Jnana Yoga, that person doesn't need to engage in any actions. You following Śaṅkara's reading? It's in the context of the previous verses. He's saying the previous verses refer to inferior spiritual aspirants who are eligible only for karma yoga because they have impure minds. Now 17, Krishna is saying, but for others, not like you, Arjuna, but superior spiritual aspirants who have very pure minds, they don't need to engage in these actions. Okay? And Sri Aurobindo, by contrast, really pushes this karyam, saying it's not karma, it's karyam, which means that realized soul, you don't have to act in order. He actually specifies on page 118 of Essays on the Gita, he says, the realized soul doesn't work for his own personal benefit, for his own personal enjoyment, but he still acts. Why would somebody act if not for one's personal enjoyment? For others and for the divine. Sacrifice. That's the whole point of what it means to work as sacrifice. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, let's look at the next verse, because it's all of a piece. Please repeat after me. Neva tasya kritenartho na kriteneha kaschana na chasya sarvabhuteshu kaschidartha vyapashrayah. Okay. Tasya iha kritena na kashna arthaha. That means that person referred to in the previous verse, that realized soul who has realized the self. Kritena na kashna arthaha. There's no purpose in, there's nothing to be gained by action for oneself, is Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. Nothing gained because you've already realized the self. You don't need anything more. That doesn't mean that you stop acting, according to Sri Aurobindo, right? Okay. Then he adds, and this is really interesting, akritena evachana. The realized soul also has no purpose in not engaging in action. This again is Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. And he's seeing this as, he doesn't say it, but it's pretty clear. He's saying this is going against Śaṅkara's interpretation. Because Śaṅkara will be saying that once you're eligible for Jnana Yoga, once you're sufficiently spiritually evolved, you drop all actions. And Sri Aurobindo is saying, not necessary. The realized soul realizes that he loses nothing by continuing to engage in action. And in fact can help others, help the world. Loka sangraha is the term used in verse 20, which we'll get to very, very shortly. Right? Okay. So this na akritena, that person not only has nothing to gain by engaging in action for oneself, right? Nothing to gain for oneself, but also sees no reason in stopping actions. Okay. Now, 19. Please repeat after me. Tasmat asaktaha satatam karyam karma samāchara asakto hyacharan karma paramāpnoti purushaha. Okay, another very key word here. Like tu in verse 17 was important for Śaṅkara because he's seeing verse 17 as referring to the realized soul in contrast to the inferior spiritual aspirant who's qualified for sacrifices, right? Likewise, this word tasma, the first word of this verse, means therefore. Therefore, after all this, talking about the realized soul in verses 17 and 18, that person has no action, according to Śaṅkara, has no action to be done. Śaṅkara says, notice this verse says, therefore, O Arjuna, what should you do? Satatam asakta karyam karma samāchara. Therefore, O Arjuna, you engage in action. You see the funny thing here? The previous two verses are talking about a realized soul who, according to Śaṅkara, should not be engaged in any actions. And so the logical sequence, 19 says, therefore, Arjuna, you should act, which means that's because you're a dummy. Arjuna, you are not one of those realized souls. You're not in the cool group, unfortunately. And so, tough luck for you, but you're going to have to engage in actions, my friend. This is how Śaṅkara interprets this verse. Tasmat satatam asaktaha karyam karma samāchara. So therefore, you have to engage in action, O Arjuna, because you're not a realized soul. And you're not eligible for Jnana Yoga. You're neither a realized soul, nor are you eligible for Jnana Yoga because you don't have a sufficiently pure mind. He asaktaha karma acharan. But now he adds, and here it gets tricky for Śaṅkara. Asakta karma, by engaging in unattached action, nishkama karma, purushaha param apnoti. A person can attain the supreme, the highest goal, the highest spiritual goal. Param means supreme. Why is that a problem for Śaṅkara? Any guesses?
How can a lower
Yeah, because according to Śaṅkara, Karma Yoga does not lead to the highest, at least directly. He'll say, yes, it does lead to the highest indirectly, by purifying the mind and thereby making one eligible to practice Jnana Yoga, which alone leads to the Param. So he always has to insert this kind of indirect, this Chitta Shuddhi thing. This pure Karma Yoga leads to Chitta Shuddhi, purification of mind, then you become eligible to practice Jnana Yoga, but the verse doesn't seem to suggest that kind of step, those stages, that sequence. Okay. And so Sri Aurobindo, by contrast to both Swami Tapasyananda and Sri Aurobindo, if you look at, which I didn't assign, but Swami Tapasyananda's commentary on this verse is also very interesting. He's saying Śaṅkara's interpretation is not justified because there's no indication that this verse and other verses like this refer only to or apply only to inferior spiritual aspirants who are eligible for action. It applies across the board to everybody. And the best evidence, according to Tapasyananda, and Sri Aurobindo will agree with this, is that shortly thereafter, who is the best example of a karma yogi who is the highest possible soul? God, Krishna himself. If Krishna continues to act, then everybody should act. God himself is giving, I continue to act, even though I don't need to for my own benefit, but I do it for the welfare of humanity and for this world. So if that's the case, Krishna is setting the example for all of us. God is our role model. And if the Avatara acts for mankind, for humanity, we should also, even not for our own benefit, but let's do work as sacrifice. That's the idea. Everybody across the board. Okay? So in the same vein, verse 20. Let's look at verse 20. Karmaneva hisam siddhim astita janakadayaha lokasangraham evapi sampashyan kartumarhasi. A very interesting and important verse. Janaka adayaha, Janaka, the great King Janaka, who was a king and yet a realized soul at the same time. Janaka adayaha, he was a householder, realized soul. Karmana eva samsiddhim asitaha. How did he attain perfection? Karmana eva. Here's another one of those little words. Tasmat means therefore in the previous verse, very important. Tu in verse 17, very important. Here the word eva is very important. Verily, indeed, alone even, karma eva. King Janaka and others attained samsiddhim, which means perfection, spiritual perfection, through karma eva, through karma alone. Okay? He loka sangram sampashan api kartumarasi eva. And therefore, you too, O Arjuna, should continue to engage in action for loka sangram, for the welfare of humanity. What's the motto of our order, which Swami Vivekananda coined in Sanskrit? Anyone? Atmano mokshartham jagat hitaya cha. Yeah, all right. You give the English translation, but it's the same thing. Yeah. Atmano mokshartham, for one's own liberation, and jagat hitaya. So loka sangram means jagat hitaya, for the welfare of humanity. Okay? And if we do that, actually that itself becomes a potent spiritual practice. And that's the same thing as saying do work as sacrifice. Not for your own benefit, but to help others and to serve others. Okay. Now, here again, I'm going to say this very briefly. I was in training center, as we all have to go through this training center for 2 years in Bilumat, and one of my acharyas, who will go nameless, was teaching us the Gita, and very talented teacher, and we're discussing this verse, and our curriculum is based on Śaṅkara. 1 year is Śaṅkara's Bhashya, second year is Sridhara Stika, which is another follower of Śaṅkara. But so it's 2 years of just Śaṅkara. Okay, so he's teaching us Sridhara's commentary on this verse. And he's saying, so he's exactly towing the Śaṅkarite line here. He's saying, yes, how does Śaṅkara and Sridhara interpret this verse? What they're saying is, yes, King Janaka and others attained perfection through karma eva. That's not karma alone. What we have to add is, they engaged in karma yoga, they purified their minds, then they practiced jnana yoga, then they attained liberation. And I found this really puzzling, and so I raised my hand and I said, Maharaj, I think that this verse is more naturally and better interpreted from the standpoint of Swamiji and Sri Ramakrishna, which is that karma yoga itself is a direct and independent path to liberation. Surely that's the force of this karmana eva and King Jana, because there's no hint that karma is an indirect path leading to jnana yoga, and then there's no mention of jnana yoga here. It's karmana eva. And then this Acharya said, he said, well, we're not talking about Swamiji, we're talking about Sridhar. And so, anyway, after class, I took him aside and I said, you know what training center is? He said, what? I said, it's 2 years of Śaṅkara brainwashing. All right. Jai Ma. All right. So, anyway, both Swami Tapasyananda and Sri Aurobindo think that this verse naturally lends itself to the view, not Śaṅkara's view, but the view that karma yoga itself can take you all the way to the highest goal. Okay? Because again, see, notice, in the previous verse it was paramapnoti. You can attain the highest through unattached action. Now in verse 20, karmana eva hi samsiddhim. You can attain the highest spiritual perfection through what? Karma eva, through karma alone. You don't need to engage in any other practices. If you do everything as an offering to the divine, as a sacrifice to the divine, that itself can take you to the highest goal. Okay? All right. So now we're going to do this time travel, or not time travel, but shloka travel, to chapter 4, verse 23. Because remember, the theme now that we're talking about is sacrifice. That's what this chapter of Essays on the Gita is about, the significance of sacrifice. So now, let's please turn to chapter 4, verse 23. Okay. Please repeat after me. Gata sangasya muktasya jnanavastita chetasaha yajñāya charatah karma samagram praviliyate. Okay. Again, now this verse also seems to be referring to a realized soul. Gata sangasya, that person in whom all attachment is gone, gata. Muktasya, who is liberated, very clearly a realized soul. He's attained liberation. Jnana avastita chetasaha, whose mind is completely stationed in spiritual knowledge. Yajñāya acharataha, if that person, by engaging in all work as sacrifice, working for the sake of sacrifice, yajñāya, as yajña, samagram karma praviliyate, all that person's karma dissolves. It leaves no trace. So Sri Aurobindo will say, what this means is, his karma leaves no result of bondage or after impression. For us, we engage in action, there's at least a little bit of selfishness in it, a little bit of attachment, desire. What happens? It produces either, if it's a good action, punya, and then that ultimately leads to sukham, happiness in the future, or we do something bad, and we want something, our own personal benefit, blah, 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 out of it. What happens? It leads to papa, sin. That leads to unhappiness in the future. It could be later in this life, or it could be in a future life, right? What Sri Aurobindo is saying, for the realized soul, who continues to act, karma is not a bondage. If you engage in action as purely a sacrifice, it will not create any new karma. It will not trap you in this karmic cycle. It will actually help you to get out of it. If you're a realized soul, you don't need to get out of it. You're already out of it, right? But this sets the example for us too, right? Okay. And now, finally, let's get to our famous verse 24. There's a lot to say about brahmārpaṇam. We should all know this verse well. Okay. Brahmārpaṇam brahma-havihi brahmāgno brahmana-hutam brahmaivatena gantavyam brahma-karma-samādhinā. All right, before I get into it, I have to tell you a story. So a few years ago, Aurobindo, all of you probably know him. He comes to give talks. He's a very talented speaker, a friend of mine, an American Swami, staying in Pinion Hills. He was staying with us at the university. I was at Vivekananda University because he has a PhD in physics from UCLA. So he was asked to go to an academic conference in Delhi. He just got sannyasa, so fresh sannyasi wearing this kind of clothes. He goes to Delhi, and he's in the Delhi subway station, metro. And he's sitting there minding his own business, and there's a young Indian gentleman who looks at him, because he's white. I mean, Aurobindo is white, as you know, but wearing Giruva. He kind of looks at him funny. And he approaches him and he goes, what are you? What are you, a monk? He goes, yeah, I'm a monk. He goes, prove it. He goes, name one verse from the Gita. And then now Aurobindo in trouble. He doesn't know Sanskrit. But then, brahmārpaṇam, brahmahavid, brahmāgno, brahmanahutam, brahmaiva tena gantavyam, brahma-karma-samādhinā. And this guy is floored. Wow, very impressive. He's a real Swami. He knows Sanskrit, so beautifully chanted. So brahmārpaṇam can get you out of sticky situations. Okay? That's the story. All right.
That's great.
So as you know, all of you have had lunch with us at least once, so you know that in our tradition, we recite brahmārpaṇam before meals, right? It's the equivalent of our grace. That's why the second study question is about that, comparing the Christian grace before meals with our brahmārpaṇam. And what are the similarities? What are the differences? There's a lot here, and I wrote some of this on the board. Okay, and so it's a little tricky. As usual, Śaṅkara's commentary, because they're almost never self-contained, these commentaries, you have to kind of read before, after. But I want to highlight two things. There's a lot there. I'm not going to go. This is not a class on Śaṅkara, but I want to mention two things about Śaṅkara's interpretation of this verse. And Kamlesh, he's an online participant. He says it quite nicely, actually. Let me read out to you part of his response. He says, Śaṅkara interprets these sentences as there's only Brahman and ladle offerings, etc. are errors, appearances. He gives an example of absence of appearance of silver and nacre in the one who really knows, to draw a parallel to the knower of Brahman and him regarding all the materials and actions as an appearance in Brahman. Then he says, brahma-karma-samādhinā, this is still Kamlesh. Śaṅkara takes the meaning of the word karma as objective. And a lot of you caught that in your response as well. And hence says that Brahman itself is the objective of all karmas. And one who has concentration on this fact is brahma-karma-samādhinā. So these are the two things. Kamlesh, I think, does a nice job of highlighting the two key aspects of Śaṅkara's interpretation of the verse. Number one, what exactly is the status of names and forms? This is a really important question. See, Śaṅkara will agree with all Vedantins that everything is Brahman. Like Sri Aurobindo quotes Chandogya Upanishad, all this verily is the Brahman. Who's going to disagree with that? It's from the Chandogya Upanishad. You can't disagree with it. Śaṅkara says, absolutely, everything is Brahman. In what sense? In his Brahma Sutra Bhashya, he says, yes, everything is Brahman, prapancha pravilapanatham, in order to dissolve the universe. The Upanishad says this in order to dissolve all names and forms. What does he mean by this? He means that that camera is Brahman. In what sense? Remove the camera-ness from the camera, what's left is a substratum, which is non-dual Brahman. That chair is Brahman. In what sense? Remove the chairness from this chair, and what's left is the same non-dual Brahman. Bala is Brahman. In what sense? Remove balatva from the bala, and what's left is the same non-dual Brahman. Which means what? According to Śaṅkara, all names and forms are illusory appearances. How do we know this? He says it explicitly because he uses the example of seeing the illusory appearance of silver in nacre. Nacre is what an oyster produces, is that right?
Yes.
Yes, exactly. Mother of pearl, which means it's not, there is absolutely no silver in it whatsoever. It appears to be silver, but in fact is not silver, which means these names and forms are not actually real, according to Śaṅkara. They're not Brahman. You subtract names and forms, and what's left, the substratum, is what's Brahman. That substratum alone is real, and the names and forms are illusory appearances of that substratum. The other more famous example is rope and snake. The snake is an illusory appearance of the rope. Just like that, all names and forms, ladle, fire, all those things that are mentioned in this verse are illusory appearances of Brahman. In that sense, everything is Brahman. By contrast, according to Sri Aurobindo, all names and forms themselves, the ladle, the fire, the offerer, the sacrificer, the priest, the this, the that, the cat, if you think of Sri Ramakrishna's example, when he's doing puja, he sees the cat walk into the room. He sees the cat as divine consciousness. He sees the puja vessels as divine consciousness. He sees himself as divine consciousness. In the sense that names and forms themselves are real manifestations of the divine. You see the difference? So some of you felt like, well, Śaṅkara and Sri Aurobindo seem to be saying the same thing. I can see why you think that, because they're both agreeing that everything is Brahman. The ladle is Brahman, the offerer is Brahman. But in what sense? That's what's important. And you can disagree with me, but as I say, I'm giving you some evidence from his Brahma Sutra Bhashya, and even using the analogy of silver and nacre and the rope and the snake. It seems to me that the key difference here has to do with the status of names and forms in relation to Brahman. According to Śaṅkara, subtract all names and forms, what's left is Brahman. According to Sri Aurobindo, and I think this is very much in line with Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, names and forms themselves are Brahman. They're real manifestations of Brahman. Okay? Now, Swami Tapasyananda, as some of you noted, on this issue, and especially in his commentary on this verse, is a little bit, feels a little bit like he's got one foot in the Śaṅkara camp and one foot in the Vijnana Vedanta camp, because he uses language like substratum again and again, or in ground. That the ground, that the realized soul sees through the names and forms to the ground. Some of you noted that, right? And feeling like that comes closer to Śaṅkara. On the other hand, he uses a metaphor from Chandogya Upanishad. He says, think about gold, and imagine that this gold is made into different kind of ornaments or toys. A child will think about only the forms of these different kinds of gold. A goldsmith, or not a goldsmith, but a gold dealer, somebody who knows the value of gold, he'll say the forms aren't important, it's the gold that's important. That's what has value, right? Seeing through the forms that could be pushed in a Śaṅkarite direction, but at the same time, the metaphor itself lends itself to more of a Vijnana Vedanta interpretation, because it doesn't make sense, as far as I can tell, to say that golden earrings are an illusory appearance of gold. No, they're real manifestations, right? So I kind of see him straddling both camps here, and it's a little confusing to me. So I kind of place him in between, but if you look at his commentary as a whole in the entire book, he very much pushes the Vijnana Vedanta line, and you'll see that when he comes to the term Vijnana in chapter 7 and other places. Swami Tapasyananda alone, I think maybe Chidbhavananda as well, but Swami Tapasyananda is one of the few commentators who interprets Vijnana and the Gita in terms of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana concept, and says that the Vijnani sees everything as God, and even the names and forms themselves. But here I find it a little confusing, the language he's using, so anyway. Okay, now, with regard to the phrase brahma-karma-samādhinā, Śaṅkara says, as Kamlesh points out, and as a number of you, Alice and others pointed out, Himaja I think also, and others, here he's creatively interpreting the word karma. This phrase is very cryptic. Brahma-karma-samādhinā, 3 words. Brahma is Brahman. Karma is, we have to find out what that is. And samādhinā is another interesting term, samadhi. Samadhi, we know it means something like a spiritual trance state where you lose external consciousness. It's complete absorption in the divine or some kind of higher spiritual reality. But it has other meanings in different contexts. So now, Śaṅkara says, this phrase means one who has concentration on Brahman as his objective. So he takes karma to mean objective. And I think you can creatively interpret the word karma in this way, using Panini's grammar, and he does his best. But it's certainly not the most obvious or natural interpretation. Whereas both Sri Aurobindo and Swami Tapasyananda, I kind of see them both interpreting this phrase very similarly. This is at least my take. Sri Aurobindo says, one who enjoys samadhi, and here, how does he define samadhi? As Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana. Knowledge, this is his own phrase, the knowledge of the entire unity. That everything is Purushottama, the divine Purushottama. Let me read to you from his commentary. He says, this then is the knowledge, so this is how he's taking samadhi. This then is the knowledge in which the liberated man has to do works of sacrifice. It is the knowledge declared of old in the great Vedantic utterances. I am he, Soham. All this verily is the Brahman. Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. Alice, you mentioned this, but you mentioned, I think you said it was from Mandukya Upanishad, but actually it's from Chandogya Upanishad. Brahman is this self. I am Atma Brahman. Then Sri Aurobindo says, it is the knowledge of the entire unity. It is the one, capital O, manifest as the doer and the deed and the object of works, knower and knowledge and the object of knowledge. The universal energy into which the action is poured is the divine. The consecrated energy of the giving is the divine. Whatever is offered is only some form of the divine. The giver of the offering is the divine himself in man. The action, the work, the sacrifice is itself the divine in movement, in activity. The goal to be reached by sacrifice is the divine. For the man who has this knowledge and lives and acts in it, there can be no binding works, no personal and egoistically appropriated action. There's only the divine Purusha acting by the divine Prakriti in his own being, offering everything into the fire of his self-conscious cosmic energy, while the knowledge and the possession of his divine existence and consciousness by the soul unified with him is the goal of all this God-directed movement and activity. To know that and to live and act in this unifying consciousness is to be free. So he's saying several things here. This is clearly a verse referring to a realized soul. What kind of realization? It's what Sri Ramakrishna calls the Vijnana realization, which is seeing the divine in everything, not just in everything, but as everything. It's more radical. Literally every name and form is the divine. And why is that relevant to us who are not realized? Because we can try to emulate the Vijnani in this respect. By doing everything as sacrifice, by chanting this verse before our meals, as many of you pointed out, this is not just an expression of gratitude. This is a radical kind of non-dualism. It's a spiritual non-duality, right? Saying absolutely everything. The person doing the chanting, the person about to eat, the food itself, everything is the same divine. And what does it mean to eat as sacrifice? The sacrificer is the divine. Sacrificing to the divine by what? Consuming the divine. Everything is divine. There's nothing but the divine. And Leela makes an interesting point here. She when I asked you guys compare the brahmārpaṇam before meals with the Christian grace, and she pointed out that the Christian grace seems to be more dualistic in general, where you're just expressing gratitude as a servant or child, like thanking the master who is God, right? Separate from you. Himajan made the same point. Many of you, Anthony as well, and many of you pointed out that there's a kind of implied dualism. But Leela made an interesting point that she said that, but in the Last Supper, Christ tells his disciples to look upon the bread and wine that they're about to eat as his own body and blood. So that there's a kind of, Christ himself may have suggested a more radically non-dual understanding of what it means to eat food and offer things as sacrifice. But that was kind of missed opportunity or something. So thank you. That was a really interesting point. So yeah, I thought that was a really interesting question. You guys gave really interesting responses. I'm not going to go through each one of them. But that was a basic gist of it, which is that Christian grace seems to be more dualistic and an expression of gratitude. Brahmārpaṇam goes further. Of course, there is the gratitude aspect, and that you shouldn't be eating for your own personal enjoyment, but as a sacrifice to the divine. But even more radically, there's nothing but the divine, and so the person eating is also divine, the food itself is divine. And so it reminds us of the highest spiritual realization. That's the purpose of everything we're doing, even in the most seemingly mundane activities like eating. Eating is something everybody does all the time. But what's the attitude with which we eat? Let's turn eating itself into a spiritual practice, and then we can realize Vijnana ourselves. Okay? And now, so this word karma, Sri Aurobindo says, karma here just he takes it in the natural sense of action. And brahma-karma-samādhinā, he's using it as a phrase, brahma-karma, Brahman action. So the person who is in the Vijnana state of realization while engaged in brahma-karma, in Brahman action. Brahman itself is the action. The action itself is Brahman. Brahma-karma. Because there's nothing but Brahman in that sense. So even the action you're engaged in is also Brahman. Trying to keep this in mind itself is a very potent spiritual practice. Okay. Tapasyananda, I think, says something very similar. He says one who has samadhi, and here he uses the phrase unitary spiritual consciousness. I think, especially in the context of his reading of the Gita as a whole, you can take this to mean Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana as well, just like with Sri Aurobindo. Even while engaged in action, so again, he also takes karma here to mean action. Okay? So I think their interpretations of Tapasyananda's and Sri Aurobindo's interpretations of brahma-karma-samādhinā are very similar. And Śaṅkara's is quite different because he takes karma to mean objective and not actually action. Okay? Yeah.
You wrote Brahman action. What does that?
Literally that Brahma eva karma or karma eva Brahma. It means it's like the action itself is Brahman. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. I think that's enough for this verse. Okay. So now let's go to verse 25. This is a very cryptic verse. And then I want to get to 26 and 7. And then we'll call it a day. Oh, we'll take questions. Daivam evapare yagyam yoginaha paryupasate brahmāgnau apare yagyam yagyena eva upajuhvati. Yeah, upajuhvati. It's very hard to pronounce. Yeah, okay. All right. Apare. There's some yogis, who what? Daivam yagyam eva paryupasate. Who worship, who or there are different ways of rendering this. Sri Aurobindo says, Paryupasate, he takes to mean follow after. So some yogis follow after what? After the yagyam, the sacrifice, which is daivam, which is of the deities, the devas, of the gods. And then apare, there are still others. Apare, yagyena eva, others offer the sacrifice, brahmagno yagyam upajuhvati. Others offer the yagya by the yagya into the Brahman fire. This is a very cryptic verse. Why is it cryptic? Tapasyananda puts it nicely. He says, the meaning especially of the latter half of the verse is obscure. This is page 141, note 10. The meaning of the expression yagyena eva is puzzling. And now, surprisingly, Tapasyananda usually doesn't follow Śaṅkara, but he follows him here. He says, following Sri Śaṅkara, we have taken it to mean the Atman. He takes yagya here, which just means sacrifice, to mean the Atman, because otherwise he feels that we can't read this verse properly. It's too cryptic otherwise and mysterious. So let me continue reading his verse, his commentary. Tapasyananda. Following Sri Śaṅkara, we have taken it to mean the Atman. The first yagya, mentioned in the first line of this verse, is worship of divine manifestations conceived as separate from oneself. The devas, you're worshipping these different deities. It is dravya yagya. That's the term used a little bit later in chapter 4. The offering of material objects. The second is jnana yagya. The sacrifice, that literally means the sacrifice of knowledge. The sacrifice of the individual self in the universal self through enlightened understanding. Himaja asked a question about sacrifice of knowledge here. I have a feeling it could be an English issue, so I'm going to teach you a very brief grammar lesson here. Okay, anyone who's interested. Sacrifice of knowledge. Here's the problem in English. The of here is ambiguous. It can be a subjective genitive or it could be an objective genitive. Let me give you a simple example. The phrase, fear of Himaja. Fear of Himaja could mean Himaja's fear. Or it could mean another person has fear of Himaja. Another person has fear of Himaja is taking the of as objective genitive. Himaja is the object. She's the one inspiring fear in others. Whereas Himaja's fear it's Himaja's own fear, subjective genitive. So now, what exactly is sacrifice of knowledge? It's jnana yagya, which means sorry?
Subjective.
So the way you'd render it in English to make it very clear that it's a subjective genitive is knowledge sacrifice. Knowledge hyphen sacrifice. Which means the knowledge itself is the sacrifice. It's sacrifice in the form of spiritual knowledge. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you're not actually sacrificing knowledge. You're not saying, goodbye knowledge. I've had enough of you. Was that behind your question? Yeah, so it wasn't, right. It's an English subjective versus objective genitive issue. So here again, when Tapasyananda talks about jnana yagya, when anybody talks about jnana yagya, it's mentioned in the Gita. Take it as subjective genitive. The knowledge itself is the sacrifice. It's sacrifice in the form of spiritual knowledge. All right. So now, how does Sri Aurobindo, following Śaṅkara, interpret this verse? The first line of this verse is referring to a material kind of sacrifice along the lines of the Vedic ritualistic sacrifices. You're offering something into a fire and you get something in return. Very kind of crude, somewhat worldly, but a kind of refined hedonism, we can call it. Vedic hedonism. The second line is sacrifice of knowledge. And this is a higher spiritual sacrifice. And they're taking, because it sounds somehow paradoxical and weird to say that they're offering sacrifice by the sacrifice, yagyena eva, by sacrifice itself. And they can't make heads or tails of it, so Śaṅkara and Swami Tapasyananda say, no, let's take yagya here to mean the Atman. And so Tapasyananda will say, what this should mean is, this is a sacrifice of knowledge, the sacrifice of the Jivatman, the individual self, in the Supreme Atman, the universal self, through enlightened understanding. Sacrifice of the individual self in the Supreme Self. Sri Aurobindo has a very different interpretation, which is quite interesting. I mean, he has a very different way of understanding this. Yagyena eva, offering sacrifice by means of sacrifice. What does it mean? He's saying, let me read you his commentary. He says, this is the explanation of the whole verse. He says, those who follow after the sacrifice of the gods, these devas, conceive of the divine in various forms and powers, and seek him by various means. This is really important, this phrase. By various means, ordinances, dharmas, laws, or, as you might say, settled rites of action, self-discipline, consecrated works. They employ all sorts of different methods, different kinds of rituals prescribed by the Vedas, and many other things. To do what? Okay, but to get their whatever they're looking for. Happiness here and hereafter. But for those who have the knowledge, spiritual Vedantic knowledge, Vijnana kind of knowledge, he says, how does he interpret Yajnana Eva? The simple fact of sacrifice, of offering whatever work to the divine itself, of casting all their activities into the unified divine consciousness and energy, is their one means, their one dharma. Notice how he's contrasting the first line with the second line of this verse. That's why I'm saying you have to remember the various means. In the first line, it's, let me follow to the letter exactly what the Vedas are telling me to do. I have to put this much ghee into the fire and repeat these mantras recited by this particular priest while my wife is standing near me. And you always have to have your companion with you to do these sacrifices. They're householders. And this and that. Everything has to be, okay. And there are various means. This one is, the second line is sacrifice of knowledge in the sense of jnana yajna, where anything you do, just by treating that as a sacrifice, changing the attitude with which you do it, where you just renounce all desire for fruits, you don't care for any happiness here or hereafter, you're doing it just as a sacrifice to the divine. That simple act of sacrifice itself is the main sadhana, is the only sadhana. In chapter 9 of the Gita, there's another verse, wonderful verse along the same lines. Yat karoshi yadashnasi yadjuhoshi dadasi yat tapassi kaunteya tat kurushva madharpanam. Krishna tells Arjuna, whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you offer, whatever sacrifice you make, whatever austerities you perform, do it as an offering to me. Do it for me. It's the same idea. That's what I think the second line of verse 25 is referring to, according to Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. So it's a very different kind of, instead of taking yajna to mean atman here, he's taking it to mean sacrifice, but he's saying by the simple act of sacrifice, taking everything as an act of sacrifice, literally everything we do, then we can reach the highest through that one sadhana alone. Right? All right. Now we get to 26 and 27. We're going to read both of them together, and we're going to talk about study question 3 in this context. Your very nice responses to them. Shrotradini indriyanyanye Sanyamagnishu Juhvati Shabdadin Vishayananya Indriyagnishu Juhvati. Verse 27. Sarvani indriya karmani prana karmani chapare Atma Sanyama Yogagno Juhvati Jnana Deepite. Okay, so let's go back to 26 here. Anye, some people, Shrotra Adini Indriyani, offer the different senses like hearing, the faculty of hearing, faculty of sight, and so on. Indriyani, all those senses. Sanyama Agnishu Juhvati. They sacrifice it into the what? Into the fire of self-control. Into the fire of control, literally. Sanyama means control, restraint. Anye Shabda Adin Vishayan Indriya Agnishu Juhvati. And then there's still others who, what? Offer sounds. Now these are the actual sense objects. The things you see, the things you hear, the things you smell, right, and touch. The sense objects. What's happening? This is the other kinds of people. How are they engaging in sacrifice? They're offering the objects, the sense objects themselves, these Vishayan, Indriya Agnishu Juhvati. They're sacrificing them into the fire of the sense organs themselves, into the Indriya Agni. It's a very beautiful metaphor. So now, this is important to keep in mind. These next few verses are all explaining sacrifice in a very beautiful metaphorical way. Okay? So many different kinds of sacrifice. It could be swadhyaya, study of the scriptures. It could be engaging in austerities. It could be engaging in sense control. It could be engaging in self-control. It could be engaging in worship. All these are different. Knowledge is another form of sacrifice. So Sri Aurobindo says when we read the verses in the previous chapter on sacrifice, even though they seem very kind of literal and about Vedic ritualistic sacrifice, we should keep in mind, we should read them in the light of these subsequent verses. These are the verses he has in mind, giving a very spiritual, symbolic interpretation. Because what is Vedanta? Go back to even the most ancient Upanishads. Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad begins by talking about the Ashvamedha sacrifice, which is one of the most famous Vedic sacrifices. In the Vedas themselves, it seems to be a literal sacrifice of a horse. They used to sacrifice large animals, so a horse. They'll take a horse, sacrifice it in the fire. What does the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad say? Each part of that horse, the horse itself has a very symbolic cosmic meaning. And each part of the horse corresponds to a different part of the cosmos. And so the whole sacrifice is not an actual literal physical sacrifice of an actual horse. It becomes spiritualized. So what Vedanta does, just like when Christ says, I have come to fulfill, not to destroy, Vedanta accepts these Vedic ritualistic sacrifices and gives them a spiritual meaning. And so that's exactly like the Upanishads are doing vis-a-vis the Vedic ritualistic sacrifices, giving them a symbolic spiritual interpretation. That's exactly what Bhagavan Krishna is doing in the Gita here. Yes, we fully accept what the Vedas are talking about when they're talking about sacrifice, yajna. But the concept of sacrifice has to be interpreted in a much more symbolic and spiritual manner. That's the idea. Yeah.
The thing that's confusing about sacrifice is, I think there are various objects being offered, but to what it's offered, I think is where, it sometimes, if you just thought about it as a fire in the crude sense, it was kind of...
Well, because Agni itself is a deva.
Exactly. And then it is expanded to devas, so you could see a little bit more. And then it seems like the highest meaning is it's being offered to God.
Sri Aurobindo says, his interpretation is, there's nothing but divine Purushottama manifest as a different devas. He doesn't deny the reality of these devas. All these devas are different manifestations of one and the same Purushottama. But so the important thing as sadhakas is to always keep in mind, this is not polytheism. This is one of the big mistakes that people make about Hinduism. Even some Hindus think that it's a polytheistic religion. It's not that. There's only one divine, manifest in infinite forms. Even the devas, which doesn't deny the existence of the devas, right? And that's the thing, is that they have their different territories, right? And so there's Yama, the Lord of Death, also a manifestation of the divine. But his domain is what? Death. And he keeps tabs on us, and he's got the sickle in his hand. But still, same Purushottama, right? Okay. So now, I want to finish by just talking about, you guys give very thoughtful responses to this study question number 3. According to Sri Aurobindo, verses 4.26 to 27 metaphorically elaborate 3 subtly different methods of self-control. What are these 3 methods of self-control? How might these methods of self-control be helpful in our day-to-day spiritual life? Please give some concrete examples. Now, it gets a little bit tricky, but I think you guys were pretty much, you got the main idea. The first practice mentioned, is, so, Shrotradini Indriyani, Sanyamagashu. You are basically engaging in sense control of the senses. I think most of you got this. That's the first kind of sacrifice, because the metaphor here is, some offer hearing and the other senses into the fires of control, which means you are exercising control over your sense organs. You might be restraining them, preventing them from going outward, so on and so forth. Kamlesh helpfully suggests that he's linking it to the verse 2.58, which is about the tortoise, kurma, withdrawing its limbs the moment it's confronted with a sense object, which means sense organ, whatever it is, sight or ear, don't go toward that object. So that would be kind of the first method of self-control, the first kind of sacrifice of self-control. Second method is where the senses are actually actively perceiving the objects, but you're offering those sense objects as a sacrifice to the sense organs themselves. It's a very beautiful metaphor, but what exactly does it mean? A lot of you suggested that what this means is, and I won't read the individual ones, but a lot of you are on the same page on this, basically. This second method is, you're not actually, like the tortoise, preventing yourself from perceiving the sense objects. You are perceiving them, but without the attachment or aversion that people naturally feel towards sense objects in general. In an unattached way, you're perceiving this, because you're stationed in the deeper soul within. So the soul manifests. You are still in the world, but you're not of it, right? Isn't there a Lost episode where there's a tattoo? Somebody has a tattoo. It says, "I'm not of the world," or "I'm of the world." But not. Anyway, there's some spiritual message there that I remember. What is it?
But it's a
It's a common
Christian.
Oh, is that a thing? Yeah.
It's a Christian
But that's very much
verse.
Vedantic as well.
Yeah.
Like the lotus leaf over above the water, right? So be in the world but not of the world. So in that way, don't let worldliness affect you. So you're still perceiving everything. You don't have to run off to a cave, but you're not affected by, especially by raga, dvesha, aversion, attraction, those kinds of things. And the third method is even more cryptic in a way. So it's the whole verse 27. Let's first just parse it. Okay, we already read it. So, apare sarvani indriya karmani. There are still others who, sarvani indriya karmani, who offer all the actions of the sense and prana karmani, all the actions of the vital force, into the fire of the yoga of self-control kindled by jnana, by knowledge. Okay, so here, I think everybody, Sri Aurobindo, Śaṅkara, they all take this to be the standpoint of a realized soul. So that's one of the key differences. In the previous verse, it's describing two methods employed by a sadhaka, a spiritual aspirant, who has not yet attained realization. Verse 27 seems to be applying to a realized soul. Okay, and what kind of sacrifice is done here? Sri Aurobindo says, there is the discipline by which when the self is known, so that's clearly a realization of the higher self, all the actions of the sense perceptions and all the actions of the vital being are received into that one still and tranquil soul. The sacrifice is made into the Atman itself, which you have already realized. And because you are fully identified with the Atman, you're not affected by anything in this world. And this whole world and all your action in the world becomes a grand sacrifice to the divine, which you know you are and which everything else is. Okay, I can't resist sharing with you Kamlesh, this new online participant. He says that because I asked also, how does this relate to our day-to-day spiritual life? Well, maybe I shouldn't have mentioned his name. It doesn't matter. I think he's cool with it. He'll be cool with it. Okay, even though I don't know who he is. Okay, he says, he goes, I really like this example. He says, I will give one personal example. I used to binge watch web series, sometimes throughout the night. This will spoil my next day, and I used to feel remorseful as well, but repeated this behavior nonetheless. To solve it, I started with forceful withdrawal. I did not renew the subscription of OTT channels. He's from India, so I don't know what OTT channel means. Anyway, okay. Yeah, what does that mean? Cable. Okay, yeah, yeah. Oh, Netflix. Okay, I see. Okay, which means what? That corresponds to the first method, which is that you're depriving yourself of these things, right?
Right.
It's like this. Like if I really like dark chocolate, right? If my mom gives me dark chocolate, what's going to happen? It'll be in my room. It'll be a temptation. I'm going to have to eat it. Better not to keep it in my room, right? So it's like that. First method. Then he says, I started watching Vedanta channels and reading Vedanta books instead. A few years down the line, even though I have access to these channels and there are popular web series which have released in recent past, people from India would know about Mirzapur. Smiley face. I have no idea what Mirzapur is. Suman is up on all this. But I don't feel like watching them anymore. So this is, I like it. This is nice.
It's great.
Anyway, it's good. And I won't embarrass any of you.
No.
But yeah. Okay. All right, good. Questions? We managed to cover quite a few verses. Look at that. That was a feat. Now I've struck all of you dumb. Yes, Suman.
Maharaj, regarding the lower devatas actually being the manifestation
Yes.
of the Brahman,
Purushottama, yeah.
and hence Hinduism actually is monotheism and not polytheism.
Correct.
Other people will think.
Mm.
But is it possible? I think sometimes the dualists and the Vishishtadvaitarians will oppose this statement, saying that this is actually from the Advaita Vedanta point of view, but actually from the dualist point of view, there are the real devatas.
Okay, but actually even Madhva will say, see, the thing is Madhva, okay, in his view, for instance, Vishnu is the highest and he is the supreme deity. He'll accept the reality of devas as well, and the devas are not the same as Vishnu, but they're not on a par with Vishnu. That's the crucial thing. They're his subordinates and he has full control over them as well, which still means that it's still monotheism, because these devas, according to Madhva, don't have the theistic attributes. They're not omnipotent. They're not omniscient. They're not perfectly loving. They, in fact, have many human foibles, like the Greek gods do. Also, they do the darndest things, like Zeus and very dubious things. And so the devas do too. And the Puranas are full of these stories of devas doing all sorts of weird things. So yeah, but God? No, unthinkable. God is God. And God is the one God. So Ramanuja will say something along the same lines. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Okay, good question. Any other questions? No, I can read. I can try to read. Some of your questions actually have to do more with next week's discussion, because we'll be talking about the fourth study question in that context. But I'll just, so Anthony actually had a question about the sacrifice of knowledge as well. Taken as a given that the sacrifice of knowledge is necessary to obtain true realization and liberation, does it follow that Jnana Yoga must then fall away to attain that state? I think you had this. This is almost the same question as Himaja. Am I right in thinking that you took this to mean objective genitive, or is it a completely different question? Like, you're not actually giving up knowledge.
Well, you're giving up sense knowledge, are you not?
Yeah, but it's not what knowledge means in this context. When they're talking about jnana, I think all the commentators agree. Jnana is this highest spiritual knowledge. And sacrifice of the highest spiritual knowledge is not you're giving up that knowledge, is that the sacrifice is the highest spiritual knowledge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well,
right. So I think that you guys are...
process the explanation you gave, yeah.
Yeah. So that's it. So now Himaja and Anthony are now on the same page there. So you don't have to give up the sacrifice. In fact, that's the highest goal. You definitely don't want to give up the sacrifice. The knowledge, yeah? Okay.
Well, couldn't it be the sacrifice of a lower form of knowledge?
It could be.
Higher form of knowledge?
We can
in other words, all knowledge,
but
you climb the ladder and all knowledge falls
we'd
away.
have to look at the text.
Swamiji talks about.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, it just, I mean, we'd have to look at the verses in like the particular, so let's keep that in mind for next week. We'll table it and then maybe you can bring it up next week. And then I covered, Himaja's Kiran is asking, and this is also more relevant to next week, but I can address it now briefly. She says, I would like a further explanation and clarification on what Sri Aurobindo means when he says, we come to see all beings as becomings, on page 122 of Vedanta Gita. What he's doing is playing on the etymology of the word beings. And this is a term used in Sanskrit in the Upanishads as well. Sarva Bhutani, it's a very common term. What he's saying is, it comes from the Sanskrit verbal root bhu, the dhatu bhu, which means literally to become. And so bhutani just means beings or creatures. But in an etymological sense, you can take it to mean becomings. That might just sound weird, and what does that mean? I think his point is, as a spiritual aspirant, you should try to look upon all beings as becomings of one and the same divine Purushottama. Yeah, manifestations of the divine. So this is linked to Himaja in her response, what's the connection with spiritual practice? She says the Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva. Or when I asked about the connection with Sri Ramakrishna's teachings in study question 4, actually, you can link this to the Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva. You try to see the divine manifest in everybody and serve them accordingly in a spirit of sacrifice. That's one way of... So, does that make sense, Kiran? You think so? You have to think about it more. Yeah. So the beings themselves are becomings of the divine in the sense of being manifestations of the divine. And so therefore, we should try to engage with people in the world and serve them and interact with them as veritable gods, as Swamiji would say. What is a higher temple than the human body? So instead of going to temples and then once you come out of the temple start quarreling with people, try to see God in the people and serve them accordingly. See them all as divine. Okay? Very good. Thanks, guys. See you next Sunday. As I said, same study questions. For those of you who didn't submit the study question responses this week, you'll have another opportunity. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.